You ready to talk about slots, everybody? So here's a list of resources and a QR code linked to these slides. I'll show it again at the end. The first link is the full blog because I'm going to go over some things very quickly. The next 3 links are GitHub repos, and the last link is if you want to connect with me or see any more of my work. Why am I talking about slots? Slots turn components into wrappers that enhance your dynamic content. So instead of having to decide the one and only use for your component when you write it, you can just put a little placeholder in there and pass whatever you want whenever you want. This is all based on the web component spec, which is part of HTML. So how do we make that work? It starts with a template tag and a slot tag. I have some slots inside a template tag. This template tag is at the bottom of my HTML page with an ID. It's got some styling in it. It's got a div container with 5 slots. The first is a default slot because it has no name. The second is a name slot because it has the name attribute. It's wrapped in an H2, which means anything I pass to that slot will be wrapped in an H2. The rest aren't wrapped anything. If I pass something to it, it'll just mount on the page. All 3 of the name slots have fallback content, so when we are ready to mount that on the page, that's what will be displayed if I don't pass anything to it. And to make it display on the page, I need a custom element with the shadow DOM. So I have my JavaScript script that is imported at the top of my HTML page. It makes a class named shots that extends HTML element. So we have all those goodies that you get with a basic HTML element. In the last line, I use the custom elements API to define a component named shots component that uses this class. In the constructor, I grab that template tag that we were just looking at, and then I use attach shadow to create a shadow DOM inside my component. A shadow DOM is just an encapsulated little DOM inside my regular DOM. So to make this mount on the page, we got to call the component, which I am doing at the top of my HTML page. I have all the content I want to pass currently commented out. So when we go to this page, we should see sad little John, because there are no shots on the page, which we do. You can see that the template tag here is mounting in the DOM, but is not displaying on the page. Inside it, there is a document fragment. What is displaying on the page is my shots component and everything inside my shadow root. So if we go ahead and uncomment out all my content that I want to pass, then I should get happy little John, because there will be shots on the page. I am using the slot attribute to access each of my named slots, and I am passing content to the default slot. But it's at the bottom, and when I defined this component, my default slot was at the top. So I should see that shots string above my heading and my content and my image. And if we go ahead and let's make sure I uncommented out, yep, we should see happy little John.
Yeah!
Beautiful.
Let's go!
So now that I'm passing content to my slots, you'll see that Chrome DevTools as well as Firefox DevTools will give you a little button and show you what slot that content is being passed to. If you expand the slot, you'll get a reveal button, and it'll show you where that content is coming from. You may also have noticed that Happy Little John is a little bit bigger than Sad Little John was, and that's because when we pass content outside of the template tag, it has access to my style sheet that's imported at the top of the page. And that has a 500 pixel width declaration. But inside my template tag, I have a 300 pixel width declaration. And if I go ahead and comment out the content that I'm passing and uncomment out my import statement, and we go back and we reload, we're still seeing sad, small little John. We want sad, big little John. To do that, we have to comment out this 300 pixel width decoration because this decoration is more specific than the style sheet that I'm importing at the top of the style tag. So we should finally see big, sad little John. So we talked about how DevTools gives you the slot and the reveal button, how the template and slot tags are mounted in the DOM. The template tag creates a document fragment, but it's not displayed on the page, and we created a shadow root, and that creates a shadow DOM, and that affects the CSS. There's some gotchas there. It's the biggest complaint about how web components were implemented in HTML. But you probably want to know about frameworks. React doesn't use slots. Vue and Angular do use slots, and they extend the web component spec. They saw that and they said yes and. They don't really mount the slot and template tags in the DOM, though. They consider that more placeholder. When I say React does not use slots, I mean if you are passing JSX to a component, you have to use the children prop and then tell the component where to put that JSX with the children prop, and that's it. You can't interact with it. There are the docs to back that up. Vue, on the other hand, has a whole slots guide because there's so much we can do with slots. So let's start with default slots. I can go ahead and close this one and then adjust so I'm not passing Angular every time, just to give you some foreshadowing about this talk. So slots default. I have a slots default component, and inside it we have a window image that will always mount, and a wall image that will always mount, and then a default slot, because it has no name, with a confused little John, because there are no people in this club. Where are the people? Let's give little John some people. So we're just going to go ahead and pass some content as a child of the component, just like we did with web components. And then we should see some people in the club. No more confused little John, thank God. Yeah. So what about name slots and default slots together? We saw that with web components. The syntax is a little bit different in Vue. Let's start with our default behavior from my slots named component. We've got a slot, and we're using the name attribute, just like in web components, to name it window. And if we don't pass anything, we'll get some text that says the window. Same with my slot named wall. It'll have some text that says the wall. And in between, the same default slot with confused little John, because now he doesn't even have a club. Let's give him a club. So we go ahead and use a template tag, which should sound familiar. And the naming syntax in Vue is an octothorpe or a pound or a hash sign with the string that we used for the name. And then any content you want passed to that name slot is just passed as a child of that template tag. So now, confused little John should at least have a club. But we want people in it, right? So when you use default slots with name slots, you can just go ahead and pass content wherever you want. It'll end up, again, where the default slot is actually defined. So my people, despite starting outside of the club, when I pass them, should end up inside the club, which they do. But you can also use the naming syntax for default slots, which means the name is default. So we use the template tag with octothorpe default, and it's going to look exactly the same, people in the club, as it should be. Now, we can do some cool things with Vue. We're going to start with the v-if directive, which is a directive that you can put on any element, and basically says, if you pass me a condition that evaluates to false, I won't mount whatever element this directive is on. If you pass me something that evaluates to true, I will mount this element. So right now we're using a template, and we're accessing the slot named club, and I've hard-coded it to false, so it will not pass anything to the slot named club. Inside my slots conditional component, I am using the v-if directive to access the slots attribute, and if anything is being passed to the slot named club, then this container and everything inside it will mount. If I'm not passing anything to the slot named club, then nothing will mount. Basically, if there are no people in the club, I don't even want the club, okay? So there shouldn't be anything on this page. There isn't. But if I go ahead and change this to true, instead, we're passing something to the slot, and the slot will mount. Yeah. Vue said, that's all well and good, but what if you could access content from the child component in the parent component when you call that component in the content that you're passing to a slot in the child component, and that's called scope slots. So we've got a default slot inside a component named slots scoped. And inside my slots scoped component, I have some state. I've got a shot count. I've got a message that changes based on the number of shots I've taken. Inside what I'm going to mount on the page, I've got a default slot, no name, and it's taking two props, number, which is getting the number of shots, and message, which is getting the message that changes based on the number of shots. it's also going to mount a button. So in our parent component, we're deciding using the vSlot directive to access slot props, which are the props passed to my slots. And we're going to display those under a heading, one on top of each other, above the button. So then we get a shot counter. And as the state changes, the message changes. When you use scoped slots, you have to use the naming syntax for default slots. View needs to know where to send the information that you are passing. So now we're going to have a default slot wrapped in an H2, so whatever I pass to it will be wrapped in an H2, and that'll have access to the property number, which will have our number of shots. And then we'll have a slot named display that'll get a message, and we'll access both of those slots inside our parent component when we call it. And we don't have to use the vSlot directive when we use name slots. We can just use the naming syntax to access slot props, and it's going to look exactly the same, especially because hot reloading keeps my state. So again, we'll count up and get a message that changes. Now, if you're like me, you may be like, I don't want to access the property off of an object every single time, right? So we can use JavaScript destructuring. This is going to look exactly the same. And we just use the brackets to access the properties, so we don't have to say slotprops.property every time. We just access the properties directly and take our shots. Now, putting this all together, if you've worked in React long enough, you have undoubtedly many, many, many times taken an array of data, probably from an API endpoint, and then mapped through that array and created list elements inside an unordered list or an ordered list and put those on the page. Using all of the stuff that we just talked about, we can create a component in Vue with scope slots that only handles mapping through an array and putting list elements on the page. So I am going to look at my list component, and it's going to take an array as a prop, and then it's going to put an unordered list on the page, and then it's going to use the Vue directive v4 to iterate through that array. And for each item in the array, it's going to grab a key, put a list item element on the page, and then pass that item to a prop named item on the slot named item. So when I call this in my parent component, I can define the array in my parent component. I just call that component, pass the array, use my template tag with my naming syntax to access the item directly, and then I can display this however I want, decided in the parent component. All the CSS is happening in the parent component. I can put description in front of description, but you can use this for every single array you're pulling from an endpoint in the entire app and decide how you want to display it on a case-by-case basis. And then it's just a list of shots with some descriptions. There you go. So you can also kind of do the inverse, where you just do logic in the child component and then pass that via a slot and access that in the parent component. I've seen it referred to as higher order components in React and smart/dumb component architecture in a framework agnostic way. And there's a guide on how to do it in Vue. What about Angular, though? What does Angular do with slots? The answer is some very cool things. We're going to start with the ng-content tag, which maps one-to-one with the slot tag. And if I run ng-serve, let's look at our default content projection component. We use the ng-content tag without a name, so it's a default slot. We have confused little John. Once again, we have that in between the window and the wall. And this time, I'm going to go ahead and put the people in the club for you, because you've already seen this example. You just pass it exactly the same way that we have been passing it in Vue and web components. So we've got our people in the club. Where Angular diverges from Vue and web components is how it gets cooler, not knocking Angular, but you have many, many, many ways that you can name a slot, right? So right now, I have my name slot. I'm using the select attribute to name it, and I'm using a CSS class selector as the selector that I've defined. So if I don't pass anything, it'll have the same text default that you've seen before. The same default slot is in between the window and the wall. But to access these slots, I'm using a class. So Angular is looking for the class, the window, and the class the wall. And once again, I'm passing the default content with the people outside, but they'll end up in the club exactly as we expect. And I can add more classes. It doesn't matter because the selectors are not looking for that, and that won't mess anything up. If I was, oh, gotta save. Doesn't mess anything up. Lots of potatoes in the club. If I was better at Angular, I could configure my ng module so that you could use a tag as a selector. You could use just a straight up attribute. You can use a selector so many different ways, including the ng project as attribute. So right now, I'm passing ng project as a string, and I'm looking for a CSS selector in my child component, so that's going to be chaos. We've got the default content, we've got the people outside the club, it's not going well. But if I go back and I just remove the period in front of the string, now it's just looking for the string, and our people are back, safe in the club. Angular also said, hey, remember that encapsulated CSS? We call that view encapsulation mode. There are the docs for that. They also have a conditional content projection, just like we saw with Vue. But they said, using slots to do that, nah. We're going to use the template tag to do that. So it uses document fragments. It's more one-to-one with the template tag, which is outside the context of this talk, but very cool. And that's why you should start thinking with slots. Make dynamic components that can handle whatever you want to pass to them. You don't have to decide that when you write the component. And that's all I've got. Here are those resources again. Thanks for talking about slots.
Let's go!